What if the prayer you've said your whole life is the one prayer you never truly understood? What if every word Jesus spoke in this prayer was designed to change you, not just comfort you? Millions repeat it. Churches echo with it. But repetition without revelation turns power into routine. When Jesus gave these words, he wasn't teaching a religious tradition. He was revealing how heaven operates and how a human life aligns with God. The prayer begins by establishing identity before presenting any need. And that order changes everything about how a person approaches God. The first words, "Our Father in heaven," are not a formality. They define the relationship that makes the rest of the prayer possible. Before asking for provision, forgiveness, or protection, the one praying is reminded of who God is and who they are in relation to him. God is revealed as Father, which speaks of closeness, care, authority, and belonging all at once. A father is not distant or indifferent. A father is personally invested. This immediately shifts prayer from a transaction into a relationship. Calling God Father removes the mindset of fear-driven religion where people feel they must perform to be accepted. It introduces security. A child does not earn the right to speak to a loving father. Access already exists because of relationship. That understanding transforms the emotional tone of prayer. Instead of anxiety, there is trust. Instead of distance, there is confidence. The one praying is not trying to convince God to listen, but is speaking to one who already knows, cares, and invites conversation. The word "our" is just as important. It breaks the illusion that faith is only personal and private. This prayer begins with community, reminding believers that they are part of a larger family. It creates unity and humility at the same time. No one prays this prayer as the only child of God. Everyone stands on equal ground. This removes pride and comparison, shaping a heart that sees others and sisters rather than competitors. In heaven balances intimacy with reverence. God is near as Father, yet sovereign, and above all is the one in heaven. This protects the relationship from becoming casual or self-centered. It reminds the person praying that the Father they approach is also the Creator who sees beyond human limits. Trust deepens because his perspective is higher, his power greater, and his wisdom complete. By starting with identity and relationship, the prayer corrects a common mistake coming to God only because of problems. It teaches that connection with God is not built on needs, but on who he is and who we are to him. When identity is secure, requests are no longer desperate attempts to gain attention. They become expressions of trust within an already established bond. This foundation shapes the entire direction of the prayer, anchoring it in belonging before asking, in trust before pleading, and in relationship before request. The prayer moves from relationship into reverence, centering the heart on honoring God's character before presenting any personal needs. When the words, "Hallowed be your name," are spoken, the focus shifts away from human concerns and toward who God is. To hallow means to treat as holy, set apart, worthy of deep honor and recognition. It is not about making God holy because his nature does not change. It is about aligning the human heart to recognize his holiness. This reordering is crucial because it confronts the natural tendency to approach God only with requests, worries, and desires. Instead of beginning with problems, the prayer begins with perspective. Honoring God's name means acknowledging his character, his goodness, justice, faithfulness, mercy, and power. In biblical thought, a name represents identity and reputation. To revere God's name is to value who he truly is, not who circumstances make him appear to be. When life is difficult, people often question God's goodness. When prayers seem delayed, they question his faithfulness. This line anchors faith in God's unchanging nature rather than in changing situations. It teaches that worship is not based on outcomes, but on truth. By placing reverence before requests, the prayer reshapes the attitude of the one praying. It creates humility. When God's holiness is acknowledged, human pride naturally decreases. Problems that seemed overwhelming are seen in the light of a greater God. Fear loses strength because the one being addressed is holy, powerful, and above every limitation. This does not minimize struggles, but it places them in proper scale. Perspective changes emotion, and emotion influences faith. Honoring God's name is also a commitment, not just a statement. It implies a desire for one's life to reflect his character. If his name is holy, then those who belong to him are called to live in a way that does not misrepresent him. This brings prayer into daily living. Worship is no longer confined to words spoken in a quiet moment. It extends into actions, decisions, and attitudes. Every choice becomes an opportunity either to honor or dishonor the name that has been acknowledged as holy. This focus protects prayer from becoming self-centered. When needs come first, God can subtly be treated as a solution provider rather than the center of devotion. But when his character is honored first, the heart remembers that God is the goal, not just the source of help. This transforms motivation. Instead of seeking blessings apart from God's presence, the one praying seeks alignment with who he is. There is also a stabilizing effect in this line. Emotions fluctuate, circumstances shift, and human understanding is limited, but God's character remains constant. Centering prayer on his holiness builds spiritual steadiness. Trust grows because faith is anchored in who God is rather than in what is happening at the moment. This part of the prayer also creates awe, and awe deepens connection. Reverence does not create distance. It creates meaningful closeness built on respect. A relationship without honor becomes shallow, but honor combined with intimacy produces depth. By teaching believers to honor God's name before voicing needs, the prayer forms a heart posture where worship leads and requests follow, where God's identity defines the conversation, and where devotion shapes desire. The prayer then shifts into a declaration that challenges one of the deepest instincts of the human heart, the desire to remain in control. When the words, "Your kingdom come," are spoken, they carry far more weight than a simple hope for a future heaven. A kingdom represents rule, authority, values, culture, and order. To ask for God's kingdom to come is to invite his rule to replace every competing authority in life. It is a request for divine leadership over personal ambition, social influence, and worldly systems that often operate apart from him. Human nature gravitates towards self-direction. People prefer plans they can design, outcomes they can predict, and paths they can manage. This line of the prayer confronts that mindset. It is an act of surrender that reaches beyond emotion into structure. It says that God's ways, standards, and priorities are not just admired but welcomed as the governing reality. This means allowing his definition of success to override cultural definitions, his justice to challenge personal bias, and his truth to correct personal opinion. Inviting God's kingdom is not passive. It carries the understanding that when God's rule increases, other influences must decrease. Pride yields to humility. Bitterness gives way to forgiveness. Fear is replaced by trust. The kingdom of God operates through righteousness, peace, and alignment with his character. So, praying for it to come also invites inner transformation. It becomes impossible to ask for God's rule while insisting on keeping areas of life outside his authority. This line also changes how a person views the world. Instead of seeing life only through human systems, political, social, or economic, the prayer opens awareness to a higher reality at work. God's kingdom is not limited to physical boundaries. It advances in hearts, decisions, and relationships. Asking for it to come means participating in its expansion through obedience, love, and faithfulness. Prayer here moves beyond personal comfort and into partnership with God's purposes. There is tension in this request because God's kingdom does not always align with personal desire. It may lead to patience instead of immediate relief, integrity instead of easy advantage, service instead of recognition. That is why this line requires trust. It acknowledges that God's rule produces greater good than human control ever could, even when the process feels uncomfortable. It redefines success as alignment rather than achievement. Your kingdom come also creates hope. It reminds the one praying that brokenness, injustice, and suffering do not have the final word. God's rule brings restoration and order. This prevents despair by pointing to a reality beyond present circumstances. The prayer becomes both surrender and expectation, yielding to God's authority while trusting in his ultimate purposes. By including this request before personal needs are mentioned, the prayer establishes priority. God's agenda comes before individual comfort. His rule matters more than immediate solutions. This reshapes motivation, teaching believers to desire what God desires rather than simply asking Him to bless what they already want. It transforms prayer from a list of wishes into alignment with divine governance, where the heart seeks to live under God's authority and to see His ways established in every area of life. When the prayer says, "Give us this day our daily bread," it introduces a principle that reshapes how a person relates to provision, security, and trust. The request is not for abundance stored far into the future, but for what is needed today. That single word, daily, shifts the focus from self-reliance to ongoing dependence. It reflects a rhythm where trust in God is not occasional or crisis-driven but woven into everyday life. This challenges the natural human desire for control, where people seek to secure tomorrow so they never have to feel vulnerable again. Bread represents more than food. It symbolizes everything necessary to sustain life's physical needs: emotional strength, mental clarity, spiritual endurance. By asking for daily bread, the person praying acknowledges that all of life's sustaining resources ultimately come from God. This undermines the illusion that personal effort alone guarantees survival or success. Work, planning, and responsibility remain important, but they are seen as participation in God's provision rather than replacements for Him. The heart posture becomes gratitude instead of entitlement. This request also trains contentment. When the focus is on what is needed today, comparison loses power. Anxiety about future possibilities decreases because attention is centered on present faithfulness. It does not deny the reality of future planning, but it prevents the heart from being ruled by fear of what might happen. Trust grows in daily increments, like steps taken one at a time instead of leaps into the unknown. There is humility in asking for daily bread. It is an admission that human strength and wisdom are limited. No matter how capable someone may be, there are factors beyond control: health, opportunity, circumstances. Recognizing dependence on God does not weaken a person. It grounds them in reality. It fosters a relationship where needs are brought honestly before God, not hidden behind self-sufficiency. This openness deepens connection because reliance invites closeness. Daily dependence also builds consistency in faith. When people only turn to God during major crises, their spiritual life becomes unstable, swinging between independence and desperation. But a daily rhythm of reliance creates steady trust. Each day becomes an opportunity to experience God's faithfulness in small ways that accumulate into deep confidence over time. Provision is seen not as random luck, but as evidence of God's ongoing care. This line protects the heart from greed and misplaced security. When focus shifts to storing up more than needed, possessions can begin to replace trust. Anxiety grows because there is always the possibility of loss. But when daily provision is the model, security rests in the provider rather than the supply. Peace becomes possible even in uncertainty because trust is anchored in God's character. The request is also communal. "Give us" recognizes shared dependence. It encourages awareness of others' needs and invites generosity. Receiving daily bread from God while ignoring those lacking it contradicts the spirit of the prayer. Dependence on God naturally leads to compassion toward others who depend on Him as well. By teaching daily reliance, the prayer reshapes the relationship between faith and provision. It turns each day into an act of trust, each need into an invitation to draw near, and each moment of provision into a reminder that life is sustained not merely by human effort, but by the faithful care of God. When the prayer says, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors," it introduces one of the most searching and transformative principles in the entire prayer. Forgiveness is presented not as an optional virtue for the spiritually mature, but as an essential part of a living relationship with God. The wording connects receiving mercy with extending mercy, linking the vertical relationship with God to horizontal relationships with others. This connection reveals that spiritual life cannot be separated from how a person treats those who have wronged them. Asking for forgiveness acknowledges personal failure and moral debt. It requires honesty about sin, weakness, and the need for grace. No one comes to God from a position of moral superiority. This humility opens the heart to receive mercy. because forgiveness cannot be experienced by someone who refuses to admit need. The prayer teaches that spiritual growth begins with recognizing dependence on God's grace, rather than trusting in personal righteousness. At the same time, the prayer attaches a condition that exposes the state of the heart as we forgive. This does not mean human forgiveness earns God's forgiveness, but it shows that a heart unwilling to forgive is not aligned with the grace it asks to receive. Unforgiveness hardens the heart, filling it with bitterness, resentment, and a desire for repayment. These attitudes block the freedom that forgiveness brings. A person cannot fully receive grace while holding tightly to judgment against others. Forgiveness does not deny the reality of hurt or injustice. It does not call wrong actions right. Instead, it releases the demand for personal revenge and hands judgment over to God. This is an act of trust. It means believing that God is just and able to deal with wrongdoing more wisely than human anger ever could. Forgiveness frees the injured person from being controlled by the offense. Without it, past wounds continue to shape present emotions and decisions. This part of the prayer also protects relationships and communities. When forgiveness is withheld, division grows. Conflicts deepen and small offenses can grow into lasting separation. But when forgiveness flows, healing becomes possible. The prayer assumes that human relationships will involve failure, misunderstanding, and hurt. Forgiveness becomes the pathway to restoration rather than the exception after perfect behavior. There is a transforming effect on the one who forgives. Letting go of resentment lightens emotional and spiritual weight. Peace replaces constant replaying of the offense. The heart becomes more like God's, reflecting His mercy. Forgiveness reshapes identity from victimhood to freedom, from anger to compassion. It allows a person to move forward instead of remaining tied to the moment of injury. By placing this request within the prayer, Jesus shows that connection with God cannot be isolated from daily relationships. Spiritual devotion without relational mercy becomes hypocrisy. The prayer draws a direct line between experiencing God's grace and becoming a channel of that grace to others. It calls for a heart that both receives forgiveness with gratitude and extends it with generosity, reflecting the mercy that forms the foundation of the relationship with God. The final movement of the prayer, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," reveals that the ultimate goal of this prayer is not simply to change circumstances, but to shape the person who is praying. It recognizes that life involves moral choices, spiritual pressures, and real opposition that cannot be overcome by human strength alone. By including this request, the prayer brings awareness to the inner life, where character is formed and tested. The focus is not only on what happens around a person, but on what happens within them when faced with challenge. Asking not to be led into temptation is an admission of human vulnerability. It does not suggest that God desires to cause failure, but it acknowledges that situations arise where weakness can be exposed. This line expresses humility. It admits that confidence in personal strength is misplaced and that guidance is needed even before struggle appears. Rather than waiting to fall and then seeking rescue, the prayer seeks protection in advance. This shows that transformation involves learning to depend on God's direction moment by moment. Temptation often appeals to desires that already exist: pride, impatience, selfishness, fear. By praying this way, a person invites God to shape those inner tendencies. It becomes a request for wisdom to recognize danger, strength to resist, and discernment to see beyond immediate attraction. Over time, this changes character. The heart becomes more aware, more watchful, and more aligned with what honors God rather than what satisfies impulse. The request for deliverance from evil acknowledges that the struggle is not only internal, but also spiritual. It recognizes forces and influences that seek to pull people away from truth and integrity. This awareness prevents complacency. It encourages vigilance and reliance on God's protection rather than assuming life is spiritually neutral. Deliverance is not merely escape from difficulty. It is preservation of the soul's direction and loyalty. This part of the prayer highlights that true success in life is not measured only by external achievements but by inner faithfulness. A person may gain recognition, resources, or influence yet lose integrity. The prayer teaches that being guarded from moral and spiritual Harm is a greater blessing than outward success without character. Transformation means becoming someone whose heart remains steady under pressure. By including both guidance away from temptation and rescue from evil, the prayer covers prevention and restoration. It recognizes that growth is a process, and dependence on God continues even after failure. This creates hope. The one praying does not rely on perfection, but on God's ongoing help. Each challenge becomes an opportunity for deeper trust and stronger character. This closing movement ties back to the entire prayer's purpose. From identity to reverence, surrender, dependence, and forgiveness, every part prepares the heart for faithful living. Protection from temptation and evil ensures that what has been formed in prayer is preserved in daily life. The prayer shapes priorities, attitudes, and desires so that the person praying is gradually transformed into someone who reflects God's character more consistently, living with awareness, humility, and steady reliance on divine strength.